Kia ora everyone, welcome to the third module in the series MPI Risk Framework that we have prepared or are preparing for the Pacific Island countries. So this is a cooperation project between the Pacific Island countries and MPI within New Zealand, just to discuss MPI's risk framework relating to import house standards for animals and animal products and other commodity goods. This is the third module where we will be looking at source of risk analysis information utilised by our risk assessors and risk managers for developing very comprehensive import health standards, particularly the background information that is utilised to look at hazard characterisation and also to go through those various risk assessment steps. So what we're going to do, I don't have a presentation per se, but we're going to be going through a number of websites. I have copy and pasted the relevant links into the YouTube clip that you can reference as required. We're going to be looking first of all at animals, animal products, and then go into a little bit more detail later on, looking at specific food risk analyses within New Zealand itself, when we're looking to develop surveillance programs or codes of practice just for really managing diseases that are already present in New Zealand. We will be looking at it from three different perspectives. Number one, what international information or what is the OAE or WTO requirements or WHO requirements relating to risk analysis from a food, animals or animal products perspective. So what are the internationally agreed requirements that countries are meant to be developing the risk analysis programs on? Then we'll be looking at some examples from New Zealand websites and further just a few examples from the Australian websites. And then later on, with the food assessment side of things, we will be looking at a variety of websites where countries are looking to develop robust risk analysis frameworks are able to go and to research or look into, particularly from looking at emerging risks. So we'll cover that off a little bit later on as well. So let's get stuck into this. So from an international perspective, probably the most crucial international website that we utilise is from the OAE. I know we covered this off very briefly in the first and second module, but if you look at the top here, the OAE.int has a number of different standards, and probably one of the most important ones is what we call the Terrestrial Animal Health Code. And this can be accessed online quite freely, so you don't need to pay a bunch of money for the online version, but you can purchase the manual itself. So if we look at the second link, where we're going into more detail into the Terrestrial Animal Health Code on the OAE website, this outlines all the various requirements for developing really robust risk analysis programs, but all the surrounding information or supplementary information that is required around surveillance programs, how to prevent and control diseases. So if we have a look at probably the most significant portion of the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, now we'll look at section 2, where we cover off the risk analysis program in detail, and I covered this off quite a bit in the second module, and New Zealand's risk analysis framework or risk framework has been developed heavily utilising the OAE guidelines. The third website, again put out by the OAE, is what we call the Handbook on Import Risk Analysis for Animals and Animal Products. Again, there are a couple of key volumes that we look at in detail. I've just put a link here to the first volume, what we call the Introduction to Import Risk Analysis and Qualitative Risk Analysis. This is a really great document to have available when developing your own import house standard requirements and your risk framework relating to import house standards. Again, this goes through in detail some of those things we covered off in the second module around hazard characterisation and the three key areas under risk assessment. So again, I'm not going to go through this in detail for this particular module, but be aware of it. This is what most countries' risk analysis frameworks have been developed on, and at least finding additional supplementary information within these documents. The next one, and probably most significant when you're actually researching a particular disease or a pest or an organism, is what we call the WAHID. And the WAHIS interface, the World Animal Health Information Database interface, so the WAHID interface. This is where you find relevant information about various countries or territory members or areas within a specific country regarding animal diseases, freedom thereof, whether or not a particular disease is present, whether a particular disease is notifiable, what kind of surveillance activities are in place, as well as information around vaccination statuses. So for example, foot and mouth disease, you can have countries which are either free from foot and mouth disease, or countries which are free with vaccination, or territories or areas within a particular country that are either free without vaccination or free with vaccination. This is really important to understand, so when you're developing your input house standards, you can reference back or use as part of your assessment whether or not a country is free from a disease or has freedom with vaccination, or whether or not there are portions of the country that you need to apply additional import restrictions on if they are not considered free from a specific disease. So I've just opened up one of these categories here called information by country territory. Because it's taken a while to load, I've included it within a separate link. It's a really great information to go through all the variety of key pieces or key diseases from an animal perspective, and having a look to see if a particular disease is either present or absent within that country. If it's present or absent, is it notifiable, and what kind of status the country in general, or country in question, has relating to a specific disease. So we have loaded into the drop-down menus here New Zealand as an example of a country where you can go and have a look and to see it, have a look at the status. Just be aware that if you clicked on 2020 under this year drop-down menu, you may not pick up anything because when you are submitting a notification status or disease present status and absent status, you are looking back at the previous 3 or 6 months. So have a look at the previous year if you cannot see anything in 2020 or within the current year that you're looking at. This is a really great example. If we have a look at diseases that are currently present in New Zealand, which ones are present. So here we've got the example of American foulbrood of honeybees. It's present, it is also notifiable, and it's present in the domestic population as well as the wild population. Again, this is really important to know, so when you are developing your input house standards, either specific risk management options can be applicable either to a domestic or a wild population or both. When we go further down the list, we have a look at diseases that have never been reported within a specific country, in this case New Zealand. So again, we've got a significant number of diseases that New Zealand is free from, that are all highly they're all notifiable, but that New Zealand is free from. And New Zealand is a good example of a country in the world where we have got a really high freedom status, where we are currently free from a number of notifiable diseases, and we want to keep it that way to protect our own plant, animal and human population. So we look at the type of surveillance programs in place. If a surveillance program is in place, so in New Zealand we can either have a general surveillance program or a very targeted surveillance program. So looking at the WAHIS link website, you'll be able to see when very specific surveillance programs have been put in place to continue to prove that we are free from a specific disease. If we go further down, disease is also absent in 2019. We have previously had a possible inclusion of that disease. So here you can see that the last occurrence for anthrax, again, as a notifiable disease, was 1954. We're covering it, or we're including it within our general surveillance program. and we continue to be free from it since that last occurrence. Okay, so the WAHES database, again, a very important database that we use for hazard identification, but really trying to utilise it further for our entry assessment when we're deciding to either partly impose specific restrictions on an importing country, or whether or not we have just a very broad reaching import restriction across other countries. The next one, so we've looked at the very general or international websites that we reference for some of our import house standard development. If we have a look at MPI, we have a page where you can go to look at our import risk analysis process. They're very detailed or very comprehensive in terms of providing good overviews of our risk analysis, but also go into detail where a country wants to know about our particular framework and our procedures in place to undertake an import house standard review. So this is our import risk analysis. Within the specific link, you can request on the left hand side here a new import house standard. So most of this is for our importers that are wanting to import a new commodity or wanting a review of a commodity that they're currently importing. This is particularly where there's a new commercial opportunity that has arisen, or where a status of a particular country might have changed regarding disease status, and they want a review of an import house standard. So first of all, here you can search for import house standards, and we'll go into that in the detail. But also it's got templates for actually requesting a new import house standard for being developed or reviewed. Our next link, import house standards themselves. So if you want to save a whole lot of time and energy, and you want to have a look at an import house standard and what type of measures that have been mandated for importation of particular commodities from specific countries, you can just look on our MPI website to look at where we have developed an import house standard, either very general or generic import house standards for all countries, or relating to a specific country. If we come down halfway down the page, it's got a really great search function where you can either have a look for a particular commodity itself or an organism, as well as trying to filter on a particular market or subject itself. And here are some good examples of import house standards, and when you click on the link it will take you to the import house standard itself, and also give you a bit of an overview if you just want to briefly have a look at what has been provided or recently updated. Our next website, or our next link, first of all, apologies, this link is very well, these risk analysis procedures are very old. Our MPI risk analysis procedures have been recently in the process of being updated, but a final version has not been produced as of yet. So while it looks very old, it is still very relevant, and probably a number of the changes that we have made have been relating to internal processes, but also reflecting on the fact that biosecurity and food safety are now under one organisation, the Ministry for Primary Industries, and where we have looked to align our risk framework. But most of these are still relevant in OIE procedures, and you won't see significant changes from what's already been produced. Again, a very great example alongside the Australian risk analysis procedures for copying and pasting the entire lot and making it your own with just some amendments in line with your own importing country requirements. Another relevant link, this is our sea container import house standard tool. So this is where we have specific import house standards relating to sea containers in which specific commodities are imported. So what are the general requirements for any sea container coming into New Zealand? And again, we've been sharing these with a number of the Pacific Island countries, in undertaking training cooperation activities. So many of the Pacific Islands will already have a number of these standards and guidance material, but this is just to complete the information that we need for undertaking import health standard risk analyses. This is the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment Risk Analysis Framework. So again, another really great website to come and find information relating to risk analyses that are taking place within Australia. Australia and New Zealand do have a Trans-Tasman agreement where we share information, we do a lot of research together. So much of what you find in the Australian website will be replicated within the New Zealand MPI website, except where Australian undertaking import health standard risk analysis assessments of New Zealand exports, because obviously we have some slightly different disease statuses with particular pests and diseases. So under one of these links, animal risk analysis and plant risk analysis, you can find the animal import risk analyses. Obviously these are for animal and animal products, because if you're importing an animal, it is highly likely that they are carrying very similar diseases to what you might find on an animal product, with some exceptions obviously. So the hazard identification and characterisation and risk assessment, much of what has been developed in that space will be very similar. So again, a significant amount of information on the Australian website and some really great recent examples that can be taken and applied to the Pacific Islands countries where you might be free from a specific pest or a disease for a particular food commodity. And of course the plant risk analyses, now obviously you'll see risk analyses relating to importation of plants or vegetables, for argument's sake, from some of the Pacific Islands as well as from New Zealand. So again, you can come in and look at the information relating to the hazard in general and risk management options that have been mandated within the import house standards or the risk analysis themselves. So again, some of these are very comprehensive, similar to the MPI website in New Zealand, and they're really worthwhile going through in detail and looking at the way information has been collated and how options have been developed and some of the final assessments made by the managers. And finally, within the Australian Government website, we have the Biosecurity Import Risk Analysis Guidelines 2016. Now, much of this is very similar to what we have in the New Zealand setup, although their internal procedures have been updated quite recently, in 2016 obviously. So again, some of the procedures and requirements, even before you actually undertake a risk analysis for the purpose of developing an import house standard, are really relevant here. And some of this includes how you actually prioritise undertaking a risk analysis or a risk assessment within that risk analysis. Things that need to be considered from the broader risk management perspective, and here we have economic considerations and regional differences, but also specific methodologies used when developing risk analysis for your import house standard. The scientific advisory group in this document is really great. Again, it gives you information about the individuals or the groups that might be involved in the relevant groups or relevant scientific advisory group. That is for both determining the risk analysis but also reviewing any risk analysis that is undertaken to ensure that any independent assessment is going to be impartial, free of conflicts of interest, what have you. So a really great document to review fully and utilise in your own processes. So that's the end of the animals and animal products international review. The next one we will go through a little bit more detail into having a look at food and emerging risks. So related to additional websites where we are looking very, very specifically into understanding risk assessments of food. We have, so while we have looked at a number of the links from the OIE, MPI and the Australian government, we have looked at those things, particularly relating to the importation of animals, the types of diseases or pests and diseases associated with those animals, because that allows us to give or provide information relating to organisms or hazards related to a live animal, but also animal products. Under the Codex Alimentarius or Codex site, the FAO has also provided additional information when it comes to undertaking microbiological risk assessments. This could be, for example, when you are looking at assessing the risk of Campylobacter or salmonellosis within your human population, so how risk analysis is expected to take place, and just some of the things that need to be considered more broadly from a food safety perspective than what the OAE might have provided. So this is a website, again linked within the YouTube clip from the FAO, that is quite comprehensive in nature, but also there are additional documents under the FAO website that goes into more detail when looking at particular commodities. And we've covered off some of these things in the second module, and again it's just to point it out here that the FAO does have a lot of additional information relating to food safety risks, particularly microbiological, chemical and some physical hazards that need to be considered. When looking at risk analysis or information relating to a risk analysis for an import house standard, or for the development of a specific strategy for managing a particular foodborne illness within a country, there's a significant amount of information within international journals. And here is an example of a specific journal that does have food safety related information. It's called the Risk Analysis, an international journal. There are truckloads of other journals out there as well where you can have a look for particular information. But this is just an example of a particular journal where there is specific risk analysis information. It's not all relating to food safety or animal health, but there is a lot of information there that is relevant. So don't forget to have a look at the international science community for relevant journal entries where a huge amount of work into hazard characterisation has already been undertaken, as well as the broader risk analysis framework. Next one, when we look at food safety in particular, again on the MPI website we have our food safety link. Again, this covers off food risk assessment. Now a lot of this in nature is very similar to what we saw in the biosecurity space. There is some slightly different terminology that is used, but the principles are very similar. This talks about risk ranking, risk profiling and risk assessments for both chemical and microbiological hazards, for helping reduce the incidence of foodborne illness within New Zealand. A little bit of supplementary information here, but I just want to go through some key pieces of information that are present. So the first one about the risk assessment itself, again it gives a very good overview of what NPI is looking to achieve when implementing its risk assessment framework. This is for either identifying risks, managing risks and developing those specific risk profiles. When we click on the New Zealand Food Safety Risk Management Framework over here, the New Zealand Food Safety Risk Management Framework was developed when New Zealand Food Safety Authority was a standalone ministry. Now we're part of MPI. It is still very relevant, it is very comprehensive, and the document has all relevant information about how risk assessments are expected to take place. Again, the 4 steps of the risk management framework, but also probably some key information about the role of science and the differences between the risk manager and the risk assessor, and how they work through probably the differences in interpretation, or the differences in the requirements, should I say, between the risk assessor and the risk manager. The next one from the previous website is how we undertake food risk ranking. Now this is not just relating to how we prioritise undertaking risk assessments, but about the risk ranking method across all of our MPI procedures when it comes to looking at specific risks, and then some relevant risk ranking documents. And this is again, it's got a number of different examples. I think this is a very good one from memory, looking at the burden of foodborne disease in New Zealand. It's a little bit older. When was it? 2017. It's not too old, but still very relevant. But again, it looks very broadly at the risk ranking for chemical and microbiological risks. It's not working. Yep. Next we have the food risk profiles. As we have noted here, risk profiles provide contextual and background information about the potential risk when a food and a specific hazard are combined. Again, used by risk managers and risk assessors for implementing risk management options, and particularly feeding back information to operators with the development and import house standards or codes of practice for how they can actually manage specific risks within the work environment, the operational environment. Now you'll see a number of these things might be considered emerging risks, so microplastics in the diet, something not historically looked at, but this is very recent, 2019, where they've looked at the characteristics and levels of chemical contaminants associated with microplastics in New Zealand. So some very modern information, up-to-date information, and very relevant when looking at emerging risks associated with a particular food hazard. Finally, we have our quantitative and qualitative food risk assessments. We mentioned in our second module, I think, that a qualitative assessment is the most widely used with importation of animals or animal products, but the quantitative risk assessments are very valuable for either supporting a qualitative food risk assessment or where a statistical analysis needs to take place when you are looking at foodborne illnesses in particular. So again, some really great examples of where a qualitative and or a quantitative assessment has taken place for a particular commodity, or looking at a particular hazard associated with a commodity. And a good example here, lamb carcass examination in New Zealand, where a qualitative and quantitative assessment was undertaken to look at what the carcass examination requirements were meant to achieve, and whether or not quantitatively we could look to implement a different examination system. So a quantitative assessment was undertaken to provide evidence or information to enable New Zealand to change its examination requirements, still to meet international obligations, but to provide something that continued to be science-led and risk-based. And finally, I have included here one of our import risk analysis from a while back, but I've included it because, number one, it's incredibly comprehensive as an example of a risk analysis that importing countries can utilise to either use information that's available here or as a process for actually undertaking your own import risk analysis for developing your import house standards. Now this is comprehensive in that it's 200 and something pages long from memory. Pages, 236 pages. It doesn't look at a specific or a single organism, but it looks at an entire commodity and the organisms that are associated with a specific commodity. In this circumstance, poultry products or chicken and duck meat for human consumption. So the risk assessors have asked the question, if we were to import chicken and duck meat, what are all the organisms of concern, what are the relevant hazards, and what are the risk assessments that we've undertaken in relation to those specific hazards. So if we look at a few examples, and I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail at a future module, but again we look at a is just all the examples of the organisms that have been reviewed. So here we have in section 6, first example of a particular organism, avian paramyxovirus, number 1. So we look at the hazard characteristics itself. So etiological agent, it looks at the epidemiology of the particular hazard itself. It talks about whether or not it is listed under the OIE list, and we mentioned that at an earlier link. We talked about New Zealand status for the particular organism, the epidemiology of the organism, the identification and conclusion, and then we undertake a risk assessment, and again following the same processes that our risk management framework outlines. That is an entry assessment, an exposure assessment, and then a consequence assessment followed by a final risk estimation. Then we outline the various risk management options that the risk manager then uses to determine what final risk management option needs to be imposed either by New Zealand importers or processors or by an exporting nation. Various options here. So again, in the reference list for all the information that has been looked at to come to a conclusion of the hazard as well as the risk assessment, and this is really useful again from any importing country wanting to undertake a risk assessment but not wanting to start from scratch. They can utilise a risk assessment already been done for that particular organism and just carry on from what has already been developed. And so you'll see for each organism the same process has been followed within this particular import risk analysis. Second type of avian myxovirus, again looking at the epidemiology, the hazard classification, and the risk assessment itself. So that's the end of these particular links associated with animal products and specific food safety risk analyses, as well as using a very brief and basic example of where a full risk analysis has taken place. We will now follow up this with looking at the particular documentation or references utilised for our emerging risk system. So when considering emerging risks, many of our risk assessors and risk managers have signed up to a number of different automated email websites where they will send you information relating to emerging risks or new diseases which may be present in a specific country, or where there might be a particular mutation of a disease or an organism which needs risk analysis assessment. So the first two that I will be covering off here or showing the links to and talking about probably covers off about 65% of all information that we receive in NPI relating to emerging risks. The first one being the International Biosecurity Intelligence Service or System, or IBIS. Now this was created by the Australian government, and it really is just an incredibly effective and clever website that allows an appropriate amount of searching to take place on the internet to deliver information relating to a biosecurity threat or a disease that you need to be aware of when developing or managing your borders. So down the bottom here, or up the top, sorry, let me quickly note that you need to sign up and log in to the system to receive information or to be able to browse all the articles that are present. But you can actually save a search process by which you can receive hourly, daily, weekly or monthly updates on a particular topic, and it could purely be biosecurity in general, or it could be restricted to a type of this biosecurity topic. So again, this is probably about 35% of all information they receive from an emerging risk perspective comes from this system, so it's very good. The next one is PROMED. This is the Program for Monitoring Emerging Diseases, International Society for Infectious Diseases. Now PROMED, most of you or a number of the watchers or those listening or watching this presentation may be aware of. Again, very effective website for gathering information on updates for a particular disease within a specific country. Very useful for notifiable outbreaks, or where you might be importing a particular commodity from a country where they've had a change in their status of disease freedom or absence of or presence of a specific disease. So again, very useful information, and probably another 30% of all the emerging risk information we receive here in MPI is from this website. The third one is the European and Mediterranean Plant Protection Organisation, or EPPO. This is where our plant folk within MPI receive updated information about plant health within all relevant countries in the Euro-Mediterranean regions. Again, very useful for our guys looking to develop import house standards for plants. And as we go through these links, they're still very important from a emerging risk perspective, but they are probably less utilised. So the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, they have a program called PESTLENS, and the PESTLENS website again sends you automatic updates that let you know about any exotic plant pests and diseases. So again, utilised by our plant directorate within MPI. Again, it requires a login, so you have to sign up, but it's automated in terms of receiving email updates. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency also has a plant health site that you can sign into, again receiving information. Much of this is being replicated by PESTLENS, but it does include additional information around invasive species or pests. That is really useful, again, for our plant folk importing specific plants into New Zealand. And finally, the last two, the North American Plant Protection Organisation, NAPO, has some information, probably not utilised a large amount, but it does have relevant information which is utilised and useful. And the last one being what is that one called? Sorry, it's gone off the top of my mind. The Centre for Agriculture and Bioscience International. So we probably receive about 0.1% of all emerging risk updates from this website. So again, looking at the most important ones, our IBIS, or the Australian IBIS system, and PROMED. But essentially that concludes this module in terms of looking at animal and animal products, additional food safety and emerging risk information internationally, but also within MPI in Australia, to ensure you have very robust information that you're receiving or able to access for developing your own import health standard risk analysis process. So hopefully it was useful. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.